And amid the widening conflict in the Gulf, European leaders are meeting in Brussels for their first time since the Iran war began. The summit was initially expected to focus on overcoming Hungary's opposition to a massive loan for Ukraine as it fights off Russia's invasion. But with oil and gas prices soaring across Europe, the Middle East conflict is also high on the agenda. Heading into the meeting, French President Emmanuel Macron said that he had spoken to President Trump and expressed his concern about the conflict.
This escalation is reckless. I was able to speak with President Trump yesterday, and overnight he himself called for a halt to all of these bombings and attacks on civilian infrastructure, on gas, oil, but also water facilities. And I want to say here that we support the idea of a memorandum on attacks against civilian infrastructure and civilians in this conflict, as well as a rapid de-escalation.
And for more on that, we can bring in DW correspondent Terry Schultz, who is standing by at the EU summit in Brussels. So, Terry, the spiraling energy crisis triggered by the U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran is looming over the summit. Do EU leaders seem to have any, viable fixes?
Well, certainly nothing in the short term. Everybody would love to see a quick fix to rising energy prices. And again, they're continuing to rise. But, this is not easy. You've got 27 countries with different fuel policies themselves. But everyone, of course, does look to Brussels for solutions. And we understand that in their final conclusions today, there will be a call by EU leaders on the European Commission to come up with a toolbox of quick fixes, of ways to try to alleviate the rising prices in the short term. Of course, in the long term, the bloc very much wants to move away from fossil fuels, but that doesn't help us today. And so what we would expect is that Ursula von der Leyen and her team come up with perhaps proposals on encouraging national leaders to reduce taxes on companies that are struggling, for example, or allow higher levels of state aid in the short term. They're also talking about changes to emissions policies, the restrictions on emissions in the short term. But again, none of these are easy. Even what we're calling quick fixes are not instantaneous, and everyone is really feeling the pain of this right now.
Absolutely. And we also know that the war is having knock-on effects for Ukraine and for Russia. Hungary, meantime, is vetoing a 90 billion euro loan to Kyiv and new EU sanctions on Moscow. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Right, that's already been under discussion here at the summit, and we're told that leaders have already closed that debate for this summit. Now, there are some feelings that they don't want to give Orban even more power over them, to continue making this a really high volatility issue. But as of now, Orban, has not changed his block on that 90 billion euro loan. And now this is really important to talk about because he has already given his political approval to the loan, and it's been agreed that Hungary doesn't have to contribute. Now, Slovakia is also blocking it. Again, these are countries that are not going to be contributing any money to the loan, and yet they still felt like they can go back on a promise given earlier in December and hold it up again. There are ways they can do this later on down the line with having to change the EU budget and things like this. So they really do have to come up with a solution. And on the 20th sanctions package, this is something that comes up almost every time the bloc has to try to agree on sanctions against Moscow. They usually, but obviously, for 19 times have found a way around it, and that's something that they're still going to have to work on. But as of today, that seems to be a dead issue for today.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky joined via video link. Tell us a little bit more about that and also, the impasse over the Druzhba pipeline.
Right, that pipeline is really a key issue here related to what we were just discussing about Hungary and Slovakia blocking aid to Ukraine because they, of course, do get Russian oil supplies. They're allowed to do this because of their limited options otherwise. And Russia damaged this pipeline in January. So Ukraine has said that we simply can't facilitate these shipments. And in the meantime, Russia continues to destroy our energy infrastructure, and we need to fix that before we fix the pipeline. This has really been a standoff and one that needed to find a solution before anything can move ahead. Zelensky was reluctant to allow EU experts in to look at the pipeline, but we understand that that has now been agreed. And in fact, an EU team is on the ground in Ukraine to look at the damage to that pipeline and perhaps even offer financial support for fixing it. Zelensky apparently in this call today with leaders has estimated that he could have that pipeline up and running by May. So that may be an ironclad promise to do that, may be a solution also to Hungary and Slovakia's block on this loan.
Terry Schultz at the EU summit in Brussels. Thank you, Terry. Turning now to another war that shows no sign of ending. Russian drones have struck several apartment buildings in Ukraine's Black Sea port of Odessa, triggering fires and injuring at least 3 people. Residential structures in 3 districts of the city were damaged. In the city center, one of the buildings sustained severe damage. A fire broke out after the drone strike, but was extinguished by emergency services. Now, the city's military administration said that a 22-story residential building and a university dormitory were also hit. Correspondent Nick Connolly is standing by in Kyiv. So, Nick, as we just saw there, Russian strikes on Ukraine continue unabated, but the war there has almost disappeared from the news cycle because of what's going on in the Middle East. Is that something that Ukrainians are aware of? And if so, how big is the concern?
I think certainly Ukraine's politicians and leadership is very conscious of that and very aware of that. It's not the first time, right? After the beginning of the Gaza war, even in Ukraine's backyard in Europe, this war was not necessarily always the top news story, and it goes in and out kind of the headlines. But I think the Ukrainians are doing their best to, point out the fact that Iran is getting, as they say, military help from Russia in terms of intelligence and experience of how to use those Shahed drones. So they're really kind of forcing that point. And they're also offering solutions to that issue, right? We've had the Ukrainians sending teams to the Gulf states to help intercept, especially those Iranian Shahed drones that Russia has so successfully taken over. And we also hear that there was a call between Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel and Volodymyr Zelensky. Israel has not been in any kind of rush to help Ukraine militarily during this war, but it seems like they now want Ukrainian know-how how to deal with those Shahed drones. That's something that Ukraine is very happy about. So I think they are showing themselves as being kind of part of the solution to this issue of drones. And, we've seen even an attempt to try and offer that know-how to the US side. We had Zelensky saying that now finally he had cards. Donald Trump was famously the man who said Ukraine had no cards. It seems like the Trump administration doesn't want to take that help for now, but certainly Ukraine's really pushing that kind of technical expertise and hoping that keeps kind of this story and this country's kind of military prowess and knowledge kind of in the mix.
And there's another wrinkle also here, Nick, and that's the fact that the war on Iran is also creating new and bigger divisions within NATO. Of course, Ukraine is very dependent on support from NATO member states. Talk with us about how the leadership in Kyiv is navigating all of that.
Well, I think for now, as long as those NATO members that Ukraine relies on most, the UK, Germany, Scandinavian countries are not involved, are not patrolling those straits of Hormuz, right? In terms of kind of military resources that could be sent this way, Ukraine is still pretty much okay. There is no involvement right now from the European side. Ukraine currently is totally dependent on Europe. The US does not give anything to Ukraine anymore. It just sells stuff basically for European cash. I think kind of the biggest question now from a Ukrainian perspective is air defense. We've seen those Gulf states get through basically more than a year's supply of Patriot missiles, interceptor missiles, to stop those missiles coming from Iran. Also, sometimes we hear those very expensive interceptors were being used against drones rather than missiles, which is obviously an incredibly expensive way to down those drones. And there's a real kind of panic now. Where will Ukraine get the next year's stock of supplies? Europe's still only kind of struggling to start producing those Patriot interceptor missiles itself, and still very dependent on US know-how. So we've had the Ukrainians now basically sounding the alarm and telling the Europeans it's time to get your own anti-ballistic system because you can't rely on the US to produce enough. And even if it doesn't have enough, will it sell you those missiles in a hurry? Will it prioritize you? That is the kind of primary question here in Kyiv right now.
Nick Connolly, thank you so much, Nick.